Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? Independent Evaluation Group panel discussion on effective PPPs.
And I suppose the real reason why we're here today is to talk about how effective these instruments actually are when it comes to questions of alleviating poverty. We are at the World Bank, so it is about development, alleviating poverty, and looking at infrastructure development as a view or a vehicle to achieving that particular end. So if I can begin with you. Having sat, well, you sit at PwC, and you've actually been on the ground for one such project where you actually got a hands-on feel. So, in your view, are PPPs actually a good idea?
So I'll give you a balanced answer rather than the obvious one, which is self-promoting.
As long as it's the truth.
It's the truth. I never lie to you. I never lie. The reality is, and you're right, at PwC, and I'll keep this quick, but I've also spent time in government. I've spent time at a contract. I've seen these activities from multiple sides. The most important perspective in my mind is that we build these assets that provide services to give people clean drinking water, provide power, give them housing. Whether they're done as a PPP or conventional procurement is almost an efficiency play in terms of whether they're done efficiently or not efficiently. The advantage of PPP, as I see it at the moment, is it specifies through a contract what is required from all the providers in the structure. It doesn't always work, let's be honest. There are examples, and I'm more than happy to field questions on examples. They don't always work, but my experience is that most of the time you get what you contract for. And there's an understanding is if something goes wrong, who bears the responsibility for it? On the conventional procurement side, which is maybe 80% of all procurements, you can't necessarily guarantee that outcome. So personally, I do believe they work. But I'm not a fool. I realize there are mistakes that get made, and we're forever in an environment where we're trying to improve the outcomes.
Before we get to a more detailed conversation about structures that may be, or types of PPPs that may be more effective than others, etc., Julie, I'd like to ask you. Richard makes a point and says, well, you know, it's also a question about you deliver what's in the contract, so it's all driven by the contract. But in reality, that in itself can pose a problem because not everybody knows what should be in the contract, and not everybody knows whether they're even able to deliver what is in the contract, whether you're on the receiving end. And in some environments, those who are actually drafting some of these agreements themselves aren't sure what should be in there. How does one navigate that particular issue in the context of PPPs?
Well, I think you've made about 2 or 3 points there, and I'll probably unpack them a little bit. I think one of the great strengths of PPPs are that they provide certainty, and certainty not only at the outset, but over a period of time. And in order to provide those certainties, you have contractual arrangements. And I would contrast PPPs with regulated industries, for example, where a regulator may change your cost of capital from an investment point of view on a 5-yearly basis, which is a much less certain flow of funding and a much less disciplined expectation of outcome than you get with a PPP over a 25-year period. So the first point that I would make is that it's actually one of the key elements of PPP is discipline and maintaining discipline over time. Now, that is quite difficult because it involves people understanding what the nature of that discipline is. And coming on to your second point, which is really more to do with capacity, and the capacity in many different markets to actually deliver the degree of contractual certainty that investors like, and that is a great strength. And capacity building, I think, is one of the key issues behind using PPPs to alleviate poverty. Because if you can use what is a very strong instrument, but then change it to the circumstances in the particular country, that is when you're going to have the greatest effect. Now, how do you do that? I think we've looked at it in several different ways. In Europe, we've had the EPEC. I think we are looking at it in a G20 context by having the Knowledge and Collaboration Centre. And all these are sort of examples of getting people together and sharing knowledge. And then once that knowledge is shared, coming on to your third point, I think that is the time when you will have certainty about what you want to build how you deliver it, and then how you are going to maintain it over the period of time.
Thank you very much, Julia. João, the big question at the end of the day, once some of the issues that Julia has unpacked for us have been addressed, the big question also becomes the impact on the ground. Do they actually serve the purpose for which I suppose you could say they are designed, and that is the alleviation of poverty?
Tommy, I think that you made one question before, how effective PPP is or are. I think the question is different, and then is how can a PPP be effective, which is a slightly different way. So if we can design institutions that implement a PPP or a direct contracting in a way that delivers, it will impact the lives of people if they were designed to improve levels of well-being.
But João, you're saying if we were to design, the reality of the matter is that at the moment, PPPs are being implemented. And the issue is, are they actually being effective?
I'll put in another way. The PPPs, to be effective, they demand two elements, central elements, and they can make a difference. One, that public institutions are able to plan the long term, so that they have a vision of where they go. If it is a spot, then the chances of a PPP being successful are very low. And the second is if the institutions, and not only the public, but the actors involved in a PPP, if they have the instruments, if they have the capabilities to implement a project. If they do that, then they can be effective. There is a concession or a PPP program for logistics in Brazil now. If we are effective in implementing, in 2018, the investment rate in Brazil will increase by 1.5% at least. So this makes a difference. But we need capacity to plan the long term and capacity to implement. And in Brazil, there are cases of planning and implementing, and cases of no planning, no implementing. And this is not only in Brazil, other countries as well.
Tom, if I could put the same question to you.
I think there's perhaps a wealth of evidence, certainly in the major European economies where PPPs have been widely used. And that evidence comes primarily from the audit offices of national authorities or of the European institutions, that in large degree, in fact, the results that have been sought have been achieved. I think the second point that comes across is that by virtue of that very serious examination of performance, that in itself has become a learning tool for governments, for public authorities in terms of implementing future PPP programs. So PPP is not a given at any one time. It is an evolving art. I think it is also quite important to see it in the context of the overall strategies of investment, where PPP is but one part, where public procurement, classical public procurement, is another, even more significant part, and where private sector investment is a further part. Now, look at the broader economic issues of developing prosperity and economic development that we want to look at. What we recognize is that there is no single instrument or no single approach that is actually going to meet the type of investment goals that we have. We do need a diversity of approaches. And I think what the PPP experience brings to people is that, as Richard has said, there have been quite solid results, and from time to time there have been very unsatisfactory results, but that there is a process for learning from that and actually recovering.
Michael, so what makes PPPs then interesting for those who want to invest and sitting in the private sector? What's interesting about them?
I think it's stability. I think Richard pointed out that once specified, once entered into, the private sector have got a clear way forward of what their returns would and should be, providing they perform to contract. And I think this is a real key element here. I mean, whether or not they alleviate poverty or not is really how the public sector design what their services need to be to fulfill that goal. What you're asking the private sector to do is to comply with a contractual framework. Now, I think organisations, for example, like World Bank, ADB, can greatly help a number of governments throughout the world and in the developed world in helping governments specify what they need more accurately and provide better commercial contracts for the private sector. The private sector, as Julia said, likes certainty. And what you need to do is to provide a framework where they must deliver in order to get paid. And they must be penalised when they don't deliver. I think that's a bit that people miss about the PPP framework. If you look at a lot of conventional procurement, if there's a cost overrun, who pays the price? The government usually. In PPPs, they're designed to think about the procurement of the asset and the whole life maintenance of that asset. And that creates a very different discipline in the parties involved. So I think that's a very key aspect of why people are interested in participating, because they get very long-term contracts with certainty, but it provides a framework for them to develop their business around, and that provides an incentive for them to do the deals.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.